Now let's look at one of the more important principles inside the lungs at the level of the alveolus that is necessary for the lungs to stay open. There's a law called the law of Laplace that says that the tension required to open or to blow up a balloon, or blow up any sac, is inversely proportional to its diameter, so that the larger the diameter, the less pressure that's necessary to blow up a balloon. And what this diagram is trying to show you is that there's a chemical that's put in called surfactant that decreases this surface tension and allows for these balloons to be blown up much more easily than it would be otherwise. Now with emphysema, there's actually a loss of lung tissue, and this loss of lung tissue causes a loss of elasticity. Now the elasticity is extremely important because the elasticity is what holds the airways open while you're breathing out. And when there's a loss of elasticity, the airways don't stay open the way they're supposed to. And basically what ends up happening is that a person can breathe in, but they can't breathe out. And as you well know, if you try to keep breathing in and breathing in, once you get to a certain point, you can't breathe in anymore because there's no room. And these people with emphysema are actually called pink puffers because they have a lot of air in their lungs. Their chest is bigger than normal, and they can't get it out of their lungs. And it's because of this loss of elasticity. Now, the surface tension is extremely important, and a reduction in the surface tension by a chemical known as surfactant allows for this air to pass into both number 1 and number 2. Because there's greater chemical concentration in number 1 compared to number 2, and that equalizes and allows for air to pass to both. If surfactant was not available, air would preferentially go into number 2 because it requires less force to expand. Now, there's a lining around the lung. There's a lining around the lung itself. That's called the visceral pleura. There's also a lining around the chest wall where the lung is. That's called the parietal pleura. And normally, these two linings oppose each other just like this. And there's a very, very slight amount of air, or not air, but fluid in this space right here. And this negative pressure that's generated in here keeps the lung expanded and up against the chest wall. Now, if there's a wound here and air is allowed to come into the chest, then this air fills this sac here, the pleural sac, and causes the lung to collapse, and that's called a pneumothorax. A pneumothorax is when air can get into the chest wall and it leads to collapsed lung. Now this can actually occur in one of two ways. It can occur as it's shown here with a hole in the chest wall that allows air to come in, but it can also occur if the lung itself develops a big hole in it and leaks air into this space right here as well. And this can become very serious. You notice that it shows this kind of deviating over toward the right and toward the normal lung. And this actually causes a problem with the blood vessels here. They begin to get crimped off, and it also decreases the space for this to expand. So there's all kinds of problems that occur when this becomes filled with air. And when it gets really bad, it's called a tension pneumothorax because the pressure in here gets very high, and it can actually shut the blood off here and here, not allowing blood to return to the heart, and also causes a great deal of trouble here. And when that occurs, the person can actually die. Now this is a diagram that shows the value of the surface active molecule surfactant. And as I said, this molecule, when the alveolus is small, is at a higher concentration, and so it decreases the surface tension and allows this to expand. And then when it gets bigger, it has less effect because it has a smaller surface, a smaller concentration, but because of Laplace's law, it's not needed as much. And so this allows there to be a fairly significant amount of volume exchange with a fairly low transmural pressure difference. The ease with which these lungs are inflated with all this is called compliance. And compliance normally is fairly low, but it's easy for the lungs to inflate, but when the lungs become damaged in one way or another, this compliance goes up and the lungs will not inflate. Now let's talk for a minute about the exchange of gas, and there are several things that favor the exchange of gas between the blood and the alveolus. First of all, this membrane that's right here is extremely thin between the alveolus and the external part of the lung. This membrane right here is extremely thin, so both carbon dioxide and oxygen can pass very easily here. Secondly, the reason that the lung is designed this way, with all these little sacs, is to maximize the surface area for gas exchange to occur. Third, the capillaries that are in the lungs, that is these capillaries right here, this space is very narrow, and what this does is it causes the blood cells to line up in such a way, again, to maximize their surface area for exchange across this space right here. And then, as I said, the red blood cells, in addition to lining up properly, their shape is such that they've increased their surface area for exchange. So all of these factors work together to maximize the ability to exchange gas between the alveolus. Now, another thing that the body does in order to maximize the exchange is it with perfusion. This is called ventilation perfusion match. And if there's a problem with that, it's called ventilation perfusion mismatch. And so what happens, or what that means is if there's something causing a problem, first of all, if everything is good, then the ventilation and the perfusion of this area are equal and good. So you have a maximum or a normal VQ. This V stands for ventilation, Q stands for perfusion. That 0.8 is maximized, okay? And so this is normal. Now, if for some reason you have a blood clot that blocks the flow of blood, then what you end up with is what's known as a dead space, a ventilated area that has no perfusion. If, on the other hand, there's a reason for a blockage of air instead of a dead space, you now have what's known as a shunt, and that's a perfused area that gets no oxygen. So both of these are undesirable. And the body has ways of matching ventilation and perfusion to try to maximize this normal VQ ratio. The functional residual capacity is the air that remains in the lungs after ventilation. So you blow all the air out, but there's still air in there that is exchanging with the blood. If you aspirate, you set up a situation for a shunt. And aspirate means to take in, suck something in to your airway. The other thing that can happen is this can become filled with fluid, and this is what occurs with an infection such as pneumonia. And you end up with no ventilation but perfusion. The blood clot or pulmonary embolus is what can cause dead space or perfusion or ventilation without perfusion. Now this diagram shows some of the pulmonary functions, and they each have a little name that is helpful to know. Now this is normal, this section right in here is what's normal breathing. And the exchange volume during normal breathing is called the tidal volume. This is a maximum inspiration and a maximum expiration. So you have the patient take as deep a breath as they can possibly take, and blow it all out until they cannot blow another molecule out of their lungs. And that volume from maximal inspiration to maximal expiration is called vital capacity. The volume of the lungs at the end of normal expiration is called functional residual capacity, and the volume of the lungs after maximum expiration is called the residual volume. And then lastly, the total volume of the lungs is called the total lung capacity. So these all change in the face of disease if the person has asthma or emphysema or whatever. For example, with emphysema, we mentioned that the total lung capacity goes up. The functional residual volume goes up. The residual volume goes up because of that trapped air we talked about. But the tidal volume actually goes down because the total capacity of the lung is less. And so their ability to take in extra air is decreased. Now, when a person has to exchange various oxygen, what ends up happening, gases, what ends up happening is it's a exchange of a mixture of gases. Air is a mixture of gases. It's nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, etc. And so the pressure exerted by any individual gas is called the partial pressure. So for example, here is the partial pressure of oxygen by itself is 159 millimeters of mercury. And the partial pressure of nitrogen here is 593 millimeters of mercury. Then Dalton's law says that a mixture of these two gases, the pressure of that is equal to the sum of these two partial pressures, 752 millimeters of mercury. So when you breathe in, the pressure exerted by oxygen is 159, not the total 752. So when we breathe, the air has to move. Remember, the air moves from the blood to the alveolus. Okay, so we're over here on the lung side, and the partial pressure of oxygen on the lung side is 100. In the blood, it's 40. And so what happens is there's an exchange in this direction to hemoglobin. Conversely, in the alveolus, it's 40 for carbon dioxide and 46 in the blood, so it goes in this direction. It's the opposite when you get to the cell. In the cell, there's almost no oxygen. Its face is 100, so it's transferred in this direction into the cell, and the carbon dioxide is transferred out. The body controls your ventilation by sensing these various differences in blood oxygen and blood carbon dioxide. And as a matter of fact, it's primarily due to the carbon dioxide and the resulting acidity caused by that carbon dioxide that stimulates your breathing. The medulla has the primary respiratory centers, and there's a ventral and a dorsal respiratory center, one of which controls your regular breathing and the other controls other types of breathing in response to stress. There's also a pontine center, which is shown here, and that helps to switch between inspiration and expiration. So it helps to coordinate the breathing. And these centers all do their activity by stimulating muscles, the intercostal muscles, and the diaphragm. Now there's something called the Herring-Bauer reflex, and this basically feeds back, and once your lungs get to a certain level of inflation, this reflex prevents any further intake of air. It essentially shuts off any further intake of air once you get to a certain level. And so what happens, and here this in a fairly complicated slide, but if you look at this pretty carefully, it's pretty straightforward. It shows you all the various ways in which your breathing is controlled. And let's say that everything is calm and there's no outside stimuli. Then these chemoreceptors that sense carbon dioxide and acid, they act on the medullary centers to reflexly cause you to take in air. And so the reason you want to take in air is because you're building up carbon dioxide in the blood. And then there are other things beyond that that affect it once these have done their job. And these include emotion through the limbic system. They include voluntary control. You can breathe in and out more if you want to. The voluntary, if you become excited, you tend to breathe harder when you're excited. Then there's the Herring-Bauer reflex, which I mentioned. It shuts it off. That's why this minus sign. There are various proprioceptors that stimulate, especially if you have pain. And this all goes through the carbon dioxide levels in the blood and pH. And this is the chemical reaction that leads to that. Carbon dioxide reacts with water to produce carbonic acid, and then that breaks down to form hydrogen ions, and bicarbonate ions. And this acid plus this carbon dioxide is what works to stimulate your breathing.